Okay, everybody, let's get started. Find a seat, wrap up your conversations. Okay, so as hopefully all of you know, this Thursday is test number 2. So the format will be essentially the same as the first test. There will be 20 multiple choice questions on chapter 3, 20 multiple choice questions on chapter 4, and a written question, which I will be talking about towards the end of class. Now, unfortunately, given where we are in chapter 4, we will have less time today, very likely, than we did last time for questions and review at the end. So if your questions do not get answered today, you have 2 options. You can see me in office hours, which are right after class, or you can put a question up on course questions on e-class. With regard to office hours, I will warn you, I'm a little under the weather. You may have seen me come in with a mask. I'll be wearing one in office hours too. It's not COVID. I did do a test over the weekend. I'm like 80% better. I'm definitely on the upswing, but I'm still a little under the weather, so just to warn you about that. It's also a good excuse if I say anything stupider than usual today. That's my excuse. Okay, so if I go more off the rails than normal, I have that. Because I don't really have a lot of notes. I have like scribble notes in the textbook, so but hopefully I keep it on track. So another piece of housekeeping is that the marks for the written question for test 1 are now online, if you didn't see that announcement. Not quite as good as the multiple choice, but still pretty good. Average was pretty high. Additionally, for the multiple choice for this coming test, a few of you take the exam in the accommodation center for various reasons. You may see your grade a bit later than everyone else. Most of you will see your multiple choice grade the day after the test, probably. But for the accommodation center, I have to pick it up the day after, and I'll be in BC. I'm flying to BC for the weekend after the test. So I won't be able to pick up the test from the accommodation center until Monday. So if you're doing it with the accommodation center, you may see the multiple choice a bit later, but don't panic about that. Okay, let's jump back into it. So last class, I finished with a discussion of sexual jealousy and possible sex differences there. And in evolutionary psychology, as in other areas of science, the basic way you do things is you have a theory or a hypothesis, you derive a prediction from that theory or hypothesis, and then you try to test it. And I bring this up because there's a common criticism of evolutionary psychology, and if you talk to some of your sociology profs or other profs, you may see this phrase come up. Some people accuse evolutionary psychologists of telling just so stories, which is really a fancy way of saying that the stories or the theories are unfalsifiable. This is a common criticism of evolutionary psychology, and it does apply to some papers. There are papers in evolutionary psychology that are piles of garbage, and some of them do arguably fall under this criticism. But I don't think it's fair for all of it. There are many cases, I would say most cases, I'm pretty familiar with EV-Psych studies. In most cases, EV-Psych people are very careful to spell out predictions and then to try and test them. And one case is sexual jealousy. So the theory goes something like this. In our evolutionary past, for males, sexual infidelity was more of a threat than it was for females. Whereas for females, it's emotional infidelity that is more of a threat. Obviously, both are threats to both, but the argument goes something like this. If you're a male and your partner has a rendezvous with someone else, that will interfere, obviously, with your ability to pass on your genes in a way that it wouldn't if you're a woman and a man goes off and has a rendezvous with someone else, even though it's still a threat maybe in some other ways. What's more of a threat for a woman from the gene's eye view is if the man is spending more time with someone else, maybe falling in love with someone else, and going to invest in her and her descendants instead of yours. So that's the theory, that's the hypothesis that the EV-Psych people put forward. And it leads to a prediction. And the prediction has to do with which thing should make you more jealous. So here's what, and they've done lots of studies on this, where they'll describe two possibilities. One is sexual infidelity, but no emotional connection. And the other case, there's no sexual infidelity, but there is emotional commitment. So here's the idea. So in this case, and you can imagine this, suppose you have a partner, and the partner has a one-night stand with someone. And they'll never see that person again, they don't like them, there's no connection, it was just a one-night thing. In this case, imagine they're really close with someone, spending more time with them than you, spending more money on them, really maybe even falling in love with them, but pretend you know for sure there will be no sex. That's off the table. Which would make you more jealous? Obviously both are not good, but which would make you more jealous? And when you ask men and women, men are more likely than women are to say this, and women are more likely than men are to say this. They even once did a brain scan study where they looked at how much limbic system activity there was when people imagined this. And there was again a difference in the predicted direction. This difference is not especially large, but it is in the direction that was predicted by the evolutionary psychologists, people like David Boss. Okay, another thing that I forgot to get to last time was another example of the proximate versus ultimate distinction. So remember that there are two types of explanations, proximate and ultimate, where proximate is kind of all of the causes in the immediate context. So this could be environmental causes, biological causes, could be hormones, could be it's hot outside, it's making you angry, whatever, any number of things. But it's all causes that exist in the immediate context. Whereas ultimate is evolutionary causes. So explaining why the trait in question exists at all. What was the reproductive advantage that led to that trait being selected for? And here's an example. So there's a general principle in attraction that people tend to be attracted to people who are similar to them. This is a general principle, but there's a big exception. And the exception makes very good evolutionary sense. The exception is family members. Family members are very similar to you. And the closer, the more related they are, the more similar. But the more related, the less, unless you're in Kentucky. But generally speaking, siblings, close family members, the thought of being with them in that way is, sexually repulsive. And so think about these two causes. So in the case of ultimate causation, many of you probably know, can anyone tell me what's the reason for that aversion? Why is the thought of sex with siblings disgusting from an evolutionary point of view? Your kids are going to get messed up. Yes, the deleterious effects of inbreeding. When you make a child with someone who is genetically very close to you, the kid is going to have problems, and therefore be less likely to pass on his or her genes. So that's the evolutionary explanation. But let's go to proximate. Suppose you ask someone, hey man, your sister's hot, why aren't you, He's not going to say, oh, because it would interfere with my ability to pass on my genes. He's going to say, right, he's going to say, that's disgusting, right? He's going to have this visceral disgust reaction. And the disgust reaction would be an example of a proximate explanation. You say what's going on in his insula cortex or something. So that's another helpful distinction, or another helpful example that might help keep these two separate. Another thing that I forgot that I will just spend a tiny bit of time on is on page 124, there is a list of human universals, a list of traits that all humans cross-culturally seem to have in common. One example is language. Anthropologists have never discovered a culture that does not have language. And they're all very rich. They're all very complex. They have their own structure. Many tribal languages have features that our language doesn't. So there's lots of intricacy in all the world's languages. And the capacity to learn language seems to be innate. It seems to be the case that babies are born with a readiness to learn language that's built in by natural selection. You don't have to work very hard to make kids learn language. You do to make them learn how to read and write. That's not evolutionarily natural, but the ability to speak and understand language seems to be built in and therefore universal. Humans cross-culturally are social animals. From a very young age, they are interested in faces, they're interested in eye gaze, they're interested in picking up cues like that. And relatedly, they are afraid of being ostracized by the group. They are very attentive to what their standing is, what their social standing is. They also seem to have the capacity for altruism and cooperation, which we'll be talking about later. Humans cross-culturally cooperate and do nice things for each other. And lastly, humans seem to have a set of universal basic emotions. There seem to be a set of emotions that exist in all the world's cultures, and even the facial expressions that are used to express emotion seem to be universal. We'll be talking about this in chapter 11. The fact that smiling is happy and is grossed out, stuff like that, seems to exist even in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, before there was any Western contact, which again, we'll be talking about that more in chapter 11. Okay, so I just want to say a bit about that. So the section that we left off in was the section on parental investment theory and mating systems. We spent some time talking about that last time. And before we move on in the section, I'm going to show a video from Paul Bloom. Paul Bloom is a psychologist who used to be at Yale, but he's now at Toronto. He's the one who gives those lectures that I've posted on the syllabus. And he's just going to review the kinds of things we talked about last time, just to kind of refresh your memory, and then we'll move on into types of mating systems. Now, one thing I want to mention that I didn't mention last time, I have a little reminder here. I'm sure many of you were thinking, as I talked last time about parental investment and attraction, you may have thought, well, this all makes sense for straight people, but a significant subset of the population is gay or bisexual. What explains that? Is there an evolutionary story there? Just hold that question. We'll come back to it in chapter 11. There is a discussion of that, but the types of things that Bloom is talking about here and that I've been talking about are primarily meant to explain heterosexual attraction. So we'll watch this Bloom video, and then we'll move on into the mating systems. The rest of that video is good and worth watching, but we have limited time, so I'll stop it there. So he talked there about relative female choosiness and male-male competition. This exists on a spectrum. Different species have different levels of male-male competition. And there are kind of two extremes, or two classes, that species can be to varying degrees. These are the two, by far, the most common mating systems, especially in mammals. There are two others that I'll briefly talk about, and the book also briefly talks about, but the two that I'm going to talk about now are the vast majority. And those are polygynous species with a polygynous mating system and monogamous mating systems. So poly means many, mono means one, and gaios, or I forget how to say it in Greek, but it's is woman. So many women and monogamous, I assume you all know what that means. So here's the difference. In polygynous species, one male will have many female partners. Well, will monopolize many female partners, and many males will have no partners. In monogamous species, both males and females pair bond and jointly invest in the offspring. This means that in polygynous species, there will be more male-male competition because more is at stake. Right? If you fail the evolutionary game, you're getting no descendants. If you win the competition, you get lots of descendants. This leads to a larger difference in in size between males and females, or a larger difference in other traits that are used in competition. So you can get a pretty good idea of how polygynous a species is by comparing the size of the males and the females. It's not a perfect proxy, but it's pretty good. So in some species, for example, bull elephant seals, which I'll be showing a video of in a bit, one male bull seal can have 50, 60 female partners. So there's intense competition, and in that species, the males are approximately 5 times bigger than the females. By contrast, in monogamous species, since there's not as much competition because males and females pair bond and raise the child together, there's very little sex difference. You often can't tell the difference by visual inspection. So many penguins are like this. Penguin species, in penguins, males and females are basically the same size, and that's true for most birds. As the book says, it's very difficult for one bird to raise an egg all by itself. You have to kind of keep it warm. So males and females often pair bond and raise invest in the kid together, so there's less reason for there to be male-male competition. So as I say, there's some cases of some species that are extremely polygynous, and one example, as I say, is the bull seal. So watch a quick video of bull seals fighting. This is to show you the beauty and majesty of nature, as it says here. So watch a quick video of that, and then we'll keep going through the section. Like I say, nature is beautiful, right? Beautiful and majestic. Okay, so that's an extreme case where the species is highly polygynous. Now the question that I'm sure you're all thinking about, well, what are humans like? And the answer is somewhere in the middle. We are obviously not like the elephant seals. We're not quite penguins though either. And one way to think about this is the size difference. Males are, in humans, about 15-20% larger on average, which indicates there was some degree of polygyny in our evolutionary past. Although interestingly, the degree of size difference has been going down over evolutionary time, which is evidence that males have increasingly invested more in offspring. So in most societies, most people pair bond and raise kids together, but there is some degree of polygyny, especially in some traditional cultures. There's a really interesting paper about this that criticizes evolutionary psychology's emphasis on polygynous species as analogies for humans. Because humans are a species, as I say, in which most of the time males and females cooperate to invest in children. The paper has a nice name. It's, if you want to read it, it's called The Ape That Thought It Was a Peacock: How Evolutionary Psychology Exaggerates Sex Differences. And the basic argument that it makes is, look, yes, we have some degree of polygyny in our evolutionary past, but both males and females exert some degree of choosiness, especially for long-term kind of pair bonding relationships. So I think that's an important caveat. But yes, we are to some degree in the middle. At least that's what the evidence suggests. Okay. And I mean, one thing to think about that relates to that is the peacock example that Paul Bloom said. So in many bird species, or in bird species where they are more polygynous, the males are very beautiful and well decorated, and the females are very plain. Is that what humans are like?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean, obviously there's biases on both sides in this, but at best it's a draw. It doesn't seem clear to me that males are the more beautiful, well decorated of the sexes. And what that indicates is that in our evolutionary past, males did exert some degree of choosiness. At least for long-term committed kind of pair bonding mating. The term for that, by the way, that relates both to us and to the peacock, and this isn't in the book, but it may help you, is sexual selection. If any of you have taken a biology class, you may have seen this. It's similar to natural selection, but it's where the trait gets passed on not because it helps you survive, but because the other sex likes it. and therefore it gets reproduced more. And if only females were choosy, and males were not choosy at all, it's very strange that neither sex is obviously the more plain one, or, if anything, the males are the more plain one. So that indicates some degree of sexual selection in both males and females. So we're not entirely polygynous, therefore. Yes?
Do we know anything about what causes like superficial traits to be favored, like pregness?
Yeah, I mean, we don't. One of the difficulties of website is we can't go back into the evolutionary past and watch the selection pressure unfold. The basic idea is that traits which reflect health and fertility, we'll actually talk about this a bit in a later section, I guess the next one. But many traits that are sexually selected for are selected for because of what they reflect. They reflect genetic health and fertility, and therefore that it's a good choice. Any other questions about? I think that's all I have to say about monogamous and polygynous systems. Any question? Other questions? Yeah.
Like sexual selection, like eventually, necessarily the same as natural selection, but for genders?
Good question. So yes, some books treat them as if they're separate things, but strictly speaking, sexual selection is one type of natural selection. It's just that it's not the environmental context selecting for traits, it's the other sex selecting for traits. So with the peacock, the reason the peacock has that huge plumage is not because it helps it survive. If anything, it's actually not going to help it survive. It makes it harder to run and stuff like that. It was selected for because females view it as an indication of good genes. It's like, wow, that male is so healthy that he's able to waste all these resources on this huge plumage and still stay alive. So it's kind of one type of natural selection. Yes?
Is there a difference between polygamy and
Yeah, polygamy doesn't make reference to the gender of the many partners. So polygyny means one man or one male, many females. Also, polygamy usually is used like for marriage, like in a societal context. Like, you know, penguins and peacocks don't get married, right? They just mate. So that's the difference. Any other questions? I saw like a hesitant hand somewhere. Okay. So there are two other mating systems that are much less common, but I'll briefly talk about them. One is polyandry, which means one female, many males. That tends to not exist in mammals. There's some insects and stuff like that that have that, but that's pretty rare. Another one is a term that I don't know how to pronounce, polygynandry. Basically, it's like polygynandry, so it means everyone's mating with everybody. The book also calls it promiscuity. So neither sex is choosy. They're both just, these are the hippie species. You know, just make love, not war. One example of this is actually a close relative of ours, the bonobos. How many of you know about the bonobos? Well, actually, not very many. So here's how it works with our evolutionary past. So we split off with the common ancestor with chimps around 7 or 8 million years ago. But the chimp branch split into two, regular chimps or common chimps and bonobos. So we're very closely related to both of them. The bonobos are very much a promiscuous species. Males and females are not choosy. They mate with essentially everyone. In fact, if two groups of male bonobos appear like they're ready to fight, like they're going to go to war, the females will surround the males and mate with them until they no longer want to fight. Extremely effective, as it turns out. So that's the bonobos. So very unchoosy animal. Okay. Next, we'll talk about mate preference. So different things that, someone asked about this, different things that make males and females prefer different sorts of traits. So there are many things that males and females both prefer. Many of the cues to attraction are essentially cues of health and genetic health, because You're going to be sharing your genes with this person. Your child is going to have some genes from this other person, and you want them to be good genes. Again, proximate versus ultimate. You're not consciously thinking, yes, I want my kid to succeed in passing on his genes. What you're thinking is, ugh, or yes, or whatever, right? But the ultimate explanation is in terms of the fact that these preferences are adaptive. And one way to think about that is, imagine someone of the opposite sex who looks very healthy. And then imagine someone of the opposite sex who looks very attractive. Kind of visualizing something pretty similar, right? So that's one thing that both sexes appear to care about. Now, in one case, there's a very good study done by an evolutionary biologist named David Buss, where they looked at 10,000 people from over 30 different countries. You may remember from chapter 1 or is it chapter 2? Chapter 2, that many studies in psychology suffer from the weird problem, that they only look at Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies and not cross-culturally. Well, in evolutionary psychology, it's really important to get cross-cultural studies because we want to know about things that are universal, not things that are local to one particular culture. And what David Buss did with his huge sample is he just asked them, what are you into? What do you look for in a long-term partner? Just rank kind of what's most important to you when you're making your choice. And for women, the top 3 things are kindness, intelligence, and exciting personality, cross-culturally. For males, the top 3 are kindness, intelligence, and exciting personality. Exactly the same. So I know there was some bad news in the last class about some depressing sex differences. This is one case in which EvPsych actually brought out something that's kind of nice. Now, some of you may be thinking, yeah, that's what they say. But this is self-report, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt, but this difference, as I say, existed cross-culturally. Now, if you move down the list, you do find some differences in the direction that David Buss predicted. So it is true cross-culturally that males care more about physical attractiveness than females do. I think it was for males it was like number 5, and for females it was number 7. So it wasn't like the females were like, yeah, I got a thing for trolls. Like they both care about it, but males do care somewhat more. And yes, it is true, cross-culturally, women do care more about the male's resources or the capacity to acquire resources. Now, why is that? Why do those 2 preferences exist? And here's one way to think about it. There are some things that males can more or less take for granted, and some things that females can more or less take for granted. For starters, females can more or less take for granted that the man will be able to impregnate them. Males can produce babies almost until they die. They never give up hope. Whereas females only can have kids up to a certain age, right? 40 to 50, give or take, various factors, but there's a limited amount of time in which females can have kids. And therefore, for males, cues that the woman is young and fertile are more relevant. They're kind of designed by evolution to pay more attention to that. Because as I say, they can't take for granted that the woman can get pregnant and produce a child. For women, males can take for granted that the woman will invest in the kid, because it's evolutionarily they almost have no choice, but females cannot take that for granted. Yes?
There was one study where they asked men ages I think 20 to 70 something about which women they find attractive in terms of their age, and almost all of them said below 20, so they were 20 to 22, even the 70 something year olds. Yeah. Is this an evolutionary thing or just a perverse thing?
I mean, it could be both. I mean, evolution sometimes is kind of perverse. Yes, I think it's 18 to 25 is usually what the studies find, and there's different evolutionary reasons for that. The standard view among EvPsych people is that yes, that's when women are most fertile. And you grim, I say, like, yeah, look, it is kind of a gross way of putting it, but that is kind of the logic according to which evolution works. Now, so as I was saying though, so for women, they can't take for granted that the man will invest in the kids, right? As you all know from being alive, sometimes men do not invest in the kids. And in our evolutionary past, that was something that was very important, right? If you're in the savannah of Africa, having to breastfeed a kid, good to have somebody around, who's going to stick with you and help out. So women are interested in things that are relevant to a man's tendency to invest in the kid. And you can think of it as sort of three things that kind of go together. One is that he will stay with you, right? So if he's not seeming all that interested, well then he's not going to stick around and help with the kid, right? So that's not good, at least if it's for a long-term kind of thing. Another thing that you care about is that he is able to help with the kids. Right? This is where the resources and status thing comes in. Right? The more kind of ability he has to provide and acquire resources, the better he will be at helping out when it's time to have a kid. So kind of competence and resources are important for that reason. At least that's the standard kind of evolutionary explanation. And thirdly, he has to want to help with the kids. As the book says, there are a lot of studies finding that men are more attractive to women if they're having a positive interaction with a child. Just any child. If it looks like he's good with kids, that's attractive. Because it's a cue that he will be more likely to help out later on. Whereas men, as I said, can essentially take for granted that a woman will do that. These preferences also relate to age. So, as someone said, it is universally the case that men prefer younger women, although when it comes to who do you want to be a long-term partner, it's not the case that men say 18 to 25. What David Buss found in his large cross-cultural study, if you ask people, what kind of age do you want someone to be if they were a long-term partner? Men say on average 2.5 years younger, and women say on average 2.5 years older. This is again cross-cultural. So that kind of works out in evolutionary, or it works out because the preferences line up. And the reason for the age preference for men is what I was just talking about, but the reason for the age preference that women have is that older men are more able to provide. They have more experience, probably more status in the community, and more competence. Okay. Now, for this last one, I have another quick video to show. So there are serious studies that do find this preference. That you randomly assign people to two groups. In one group, the women just see pictures of men, just by themselves. In the other, you see pictures of the same man in the other group having a positive interaction with a child. They say, hey, how desirable is this guy? And you do get this effect. But I have a study with a sample size of 1, which is this YouTuber saying that she doesn't want kids, kind of consciously, but whenever she sees a man playing with a kid, all of a sudden something happens. So we'll watch that, and then we'll move on to the section on altruism and cooperation. As I say, that's a sample size of 1, so you have to do a bigger study, but when they have done the bigger studies, they do find a pattern roughly like that. Okay, I believe that's all I have to say about that section. Any questions about the mate preference section? Okay, so we'll now move on to the section on altruism and cooperation. I'm going to start off with a bit of a paradox. It's a little bit surprising that any animals would be cooperative or nice. Because the basic logic of evolution is intrinsically selfish and competitive, right? The way evolution works is traits that make you better than other people at passing on your genes, those traits get selected for. So why is it that in many social species, animals do cooperate and even sometimes self-sacrifice to help others. So that's kind of the paradox. I'll start with cooperation. And cooperation is sort of easier to explain. So cooperation is where two animals work together and both benefit sort of right away. So we're not talking like long term, just right now. So, wolves, when they go on a hunting trip, kind of a weird way to put it, but when they go hunting, they're all benefiting, right? They're all helping each other out and they all get food at the end, right? So that's cooperation. Some kind of act where they're working together and everyone benefits in the short term. And the evolution of cooperation interests me as a moral psychologist, so I study human moral intuitions, because species in which cooperation evolves tend to also be species where a sense of fairness and unfairness evolves. It's not that the animals can articulate, or they don't necessarily have language, but they become angry if someone's kind of cheating or not being fair or not putting in an equal amount or not getting an equal amount out of it. This is the last video for today. I have a video of a study that was on monkeys. And the scientist here gives an excellent explanation. I'll just note in passing, so this is France Duval who did this work. The graduate student who you see in the video too, she actually was at my university, Georgia State University. I never met her, but she's also in the video. So this is a video of monkeys having a sense of fairness and unfairness. Okay, so as I said, it's the last video for today, but pretty hard to argue with that. So, and monkeys are an example of a cooperative species, and you do see, therefore, this kind of behavior. So that's cooperation. Now, altruism is a little bit more difficult to explain. And there are two theories, not competing, they probably both have some truth to them. But altruism is where one organism helps another at a cost to him or herself. So they're not both benefiting in the short term. One is actually being damaged or harmed or losing something while they help someone. And that's much more puzzling, given that evolution is about getting your own genes into the next generation. So one theory is kin selection theory. The word kin is an old-fashioned word for family, right? Relatives. Here's the idea. Your family members share some of your genes. So siblings share half, cousins, I forget now, whatever. They share some percentage. I'm sick, I don't remember the numbers, but some percentage of your genes. Over evolutionary time, genes which made you help your family members would have been more likely to get passed on. I mean, the easiest case of this is, parents helping their kids, right? Parents do all sorts of altruistic things for their kids across species. Well, I should say across mammals. Reptiles, they don't care. And apparently bears don't, as someone mentioned. But most mammals, they care about their kids. And even though that's altruistic from the individual point of view, from the gene's eye view, it's sort of selfish, right? You're helping your own genes get passed on. Now, no one's, again, consciously thinking that. The proximate explanation is, well, I love my siblings, or I love my kids. But the reason that tendency is there is because it evolved according to kin selection. Additionally, kin selection may explain, and this is a bit more speculative, but it may explain why our first tendency is to be nice. Richard Dawkins put forward this speculation. Given that we evolved in small bands of people, where probably most people you knew were like third or fourth cousins or whatever, it's good to kind of have the first default to be, well, just be nice to the people you meet, right? Given that we evolved in this context where a lot of the people we would have been around would have been relatives. The other theory is reciprocal altruism. whole altruism. As the book says, according to this theory, altruism is basically long-term cooperation. The idea here is, look, I'll help you today, right? I will do a little self-sacrifice, pay a cost to help you today, but when I need help, you're going to help me. Right? That's what we're going to do. So I may not be benefiting now, but I'll benefit later. In order for this to evolve, you need animals to be intelligent enough to recognize people and to be able to keep track if someone's screwing you. If you can't do that, then the tendency doesn't evolve. By the way, this is why Cosmides and Tooby predicted that we would be better at detecting social rule breaking. They said, look, because we are an altruistic species, therefore we must have the ability to really keep track of when people are breaking the rules or cheating. Yes, sir?
So with reciprocal altruism, you morph out in species bigger brains who can recognize memories and stuff?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So species in which this exists tend to be social mammals that are intelligent enough to remember people and keep track of people. And actually, in point of fact, there's some argument that this is the main driver of human intelligence, is kind of social capacities. If you look at primates, there's a very close correlation between how big the cortex is and how big the social group is. So humans, even hunter-gatherers, have by far the biggest social groups. Even in hunter-gatherer contexts, human groups are typically at least 150. No primate has social groups that big, and we have, of course, the biggest brains. And if you look at even within the smaller brain types, the variation in the size of the social group corresponds pretty well to how big their brains are. So for reciprocal altruism, this is, I help you today, you help me tomorrow. But if you don't, I'm not going to be very happy with you. So one species that does this is vampire bats, who are a very social species. So vampire bats, as you may know, fly around and suck blood out of cows or horses. But they live in social groups, and if a vampire bat has a good night and another one has a bad night, they'll share the blood. Isn't that nice? Share the blood with each other. Very nice animals. But if one animal has a good night and doesn't share with the other groups, the other animals are like, all right, we're not sharing with you anymore. And you kind of need that capacity for this to evolve. Okay. Any questions about altruism?
Is this only exam on Thursday?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, anything in chapters 3 and 4 can be on the test. One quick thing I'll add is that there's some evidence that this kind of pattern is like a very stable and effective strategy. They had this really cool game where they had a kind of a simple competitive game, and they had people submit different strategies. This was a game in which you could cooperate or cheat, right? And people submitted all kinds of complicated social strategies, but the best strategy was tit for tat, which is just you're nice first, and then if someone is not cooperative, you punish back, and that's it. And this seems to be the tendency that we have evolved. Humans are, as a rule, nice to strangers at a first meeting, but then we're not nice if someone's not nice to us. Okay, last section is on aggression. And then we'll have some time for questions about anything in chapters 3 or 4, though, as I say, not as much as I was hoping. So, given that evolution is a competitive process, most animals have some capacity for aggression, and humans are no exception. There's a long debate between different philosophers about whether humans are naturally violent or naturally kind. I think the right answer is we're some degree of both. Have any of you heard of Thomas Hobbes versus Jean-Jacques Rousseau? From a famous... Yeah, right. So Hobbes is the one who says, life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Right? Humans are kind of naturally violent. and Rousseau had more of an optimistic vision, the truth seems to be that we have some of both. One thing that evolves in some social species is dominance hierarchies. This is a way to kind of avoid violent competition. So even if you win a fight for mates or for food or whatever, it's costly to both, even to the winner. Think of that bull seal fight, right? One of them won, but that's not fun, right? That's definitely costly. A dominance hierarchy means that you kind of remember who's beaten you before or who looks stronger than you, and you kind of organize resources in that way. It's a way of it's adaptive for both smaller and larger animals because it allows them to save getting damaged. In the case of social primates, like chimpanzees and humans, maintaining good social relationships is important for keeping your place in the dominance hierarchy. So in the case of chimps have kind of alpha males who are kind of the main dog in the group because they're stronger than everyone. But if they're too dickish or too mean or whatever, eventually a handful of medium males or males who are almost as strong as him will kind of take his place, right? The tribe will kind of be angry at him. So in species that are primates, there often is a need not just to be strong, but also to maintain good relationships. The book has a discussion of that. And then the last kind of factoid to talk about is a certain type of violence that seems to be unique to a very small number of species. And that's war. I'm going to put war in scare quotes here. By war, I'm kind of defining it very narrowly. I'm defining war as kind of having three things. Groups of males, who are unrelated, or at least much of them are unrelated. They're not like siblings or something. Who fight other groups in the same species. Okay, so those are my three kind of criterion for war in this kind of loose sense. Groups of males, they're not related, fighting other groups of unrelated males in the same species. There are only two species on the earth that do this. Humans and chimpanzees. Only two. Probably not a coincidence that they are our closest relatives. So that's kind of depressing, though, as I said on the first class in chapter 4, the fact that there is a tendency towards this does not mean that it's inevitable, does not mean that it's determined, but it does mean we may have this tendency and may need to take special steps to ensure that it does not happen. Okay, so that's all the new information I have to give about this chapter. I'll give one closing thought, just because some of this stuff may be kind of depressing. This view of human nature can sometimes be depressing. One famous biologist said that humans are machines for replicating our DNA, and we dance to its music. And that is kind of the undertone of evolutionary psychology. And as I say, that may be kind of depressing. But there's at least one way in which this vision can be a source of comfort. And I'll just mention this. At least it's been helpful to me. It's sometimes helpful to remember that we are animals. And the reason is, don't set your expectations too high. It's good to sometimes remember, anything we do, just be amazed by it. Like whenever you succeed at something, just be like, wow, I'm a half chromosome away from a chimpanzee, but I was able to do that. And if you fail at certain things, don't be too hard on yourself. As Darwin said, we bear the stamp of our lowly origin. So it's not, don't put too much pressure on yourselves. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 4. Any questions about the aggression section or the altruism section? Yes?
Can you explain dominance hierarchy again?
Good, so it's a hierarchy of roughly speaking, who would win in a fight in some social mammals. And it's a way of keeping track of who gets first dibs on the food or whatever, so that you don't have to fight because it's really expensive to fight every single time before you want to split food or whatever. So it's a way of kind of keeping track. So you have to be able to remember who you lost a fight to before and stuff like that. So it requires some degree of intelligence. So that's what a dominance hierarchy is. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so I'm going to describe what the written question will be, and then I'll throw it open for any questions about Chapter 3 or Chapter 4. I would suspect that there will be more questions about Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is probably harder to memorize the information. And as I say, if we run out of time, you can come to office hours or put a question on course questions. The written question, test 2. I will describe some kind of human activity, humans doing something. And I want you to say how each of the 4 lobes could be involved. So frontal lobes, temporal lobes, parietal lobes, and occipital lobes. Just one thing for each is fine. You don't have to say every single thing they could be doing. So just pick 1 or 2, maybe a few, because some things might be more relevant to other tasks, but come in ready to talk about 1 or 2 things from each lobe, and then apply it to the example. And there will be 1 other brain region that I will not tell you. That's a good incentive for you to study all of them, what all the brain structures do. There will be a strict 5-sentence limit. Selene had a good time marking your written for the last one. And I don't want to have that much fun marking this one. And the same will be true for test 3. So the frontal lobes would make you do blah, 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 blah. The temporal lobes, blah, 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 blah. Just that. Just 1 sentence for each brain structure. Okay. Any questions about the written? Does anyone want me to review what the 4 lobes do? Okay, so the occipital lobes, vision. At least the early stages of vision. A lot of them will have multiple jobs. The occipital, that's it. It's the early stages of conscious visual processing. The temporal lobes have a few jobs. They are involved in hearing. They're right near the ear. That's one way to remember it. They also do, so that they have the primary auditory cortex, but they also help with vision to some degree. The occipital sends some visual information to the temporal lobe and says, what is this? Figure out, is this a face? Is this a ball or whatever? Now again, you won't have to say all of these. Just pick a few to kind of remember and be ready to talk about. The left temporal lobe also includes Wernicke's area. Does anyone remember what Wernicke's area does? Understand language, language comprehension. Kind of convenient because the auditory cortex is right there. Hearing. The parietal has a few things as well. The parietal includes the sensory strip, which is responsible for touch. That's a part of the parietal. It also is involved in spatial reasoning. The occipital lobe, the visual one, gives some visual information to the parietal and says, where is this? Right? Do some spatial analysis of this. So those are a few things that the parietal does. And then the frontal is the largest in humans, and it is involved in many distinctly human capacities. So reasoning, long-term planning, self-control, those kinds of things. As I said last time, it's the decider, you could say. It also includes the motor cortex, which is right in front of the sensory cortex. And that's what makes you move. It's what sends commands to the body to move. And then final thing about the frontal is it includes Broca's area on the left, which is for language production, talking, writing, that sort of thing. Yes, sir.
Our vertical area and Broca's area go to the left side of the brain?
Yes. Yeah, there was a typo in the PowerPoint about that. I put an announcement up and fixed it. If you didn't notice, make sure you download the new version because there was a typo. I mixed up left and right for some reason, but yes. In most people, Broca's and vertices are both on the left. Any other questions about the four lobes? Yep.
Could you repeat parietal?
Yep, no worries. So the parietal includes the sensory cortex, which is touch. And it also does spatial reasoning, including spatial analysis of visual inputs. Basically, the occipital is too small to do all the visual analysis, so it asks the temporal and the parietal to help out a little bit. Yes?
So just touch in a sense?
Yeah, the sensory cortex, it's sometimes called the somatosensory cortex. It's sensory just for touch. Soma means body, so it's like body sensory cortex. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Does the motor cortex only initiate voluntary behaviors?
Yes. So, yes. That's probably enough for that. Other questions? Could be about this or about anything in chapter 3 or 4. We have 10 minutes left, so happy to take any questions. Yep.
What is the knockout procedure?
Oh, yes. Here's a gift. It won't be on the test.
Okay.
Merry Christmas. Yeah. Sorry? Sorry, I still can't hear you. Oh, good, yeah. So the percentages in the 4 laws. And really it's the 3. The 3 are about percentages. Typically, not always, but typically traits in psychology are around 40 to 50% heritable, so genetic. And again, that's about variation, not about the total in the trait, but 40 to 50% of the variation is due to genes. 0 to 20 is due to the shared environment, like the home environment. And 40 to 50 is everything else. All non-home parts of the environment. All parts of the environment that siblings don't share. I think your hand was up.
So after a man is fired, how does it get some back or
Good. It kicks out potassium, which is positively charged. It's a little bit weird, but sodium comes in, which is positive, signal. Okay, now we have to go back to negative. We have some potassium lying around, we'll kick that out. That'll bring us back down to negative. So yeah, you don't need to know this, but for whatever it's worth, all the time, there's sodium-potassium pumps that are trading the sodium and potassium to make sure that there's enough potassium inside to go out when it needs to, and enough sodium outside to come in. Good question. Good, I'll do those quickly. So, CAT scan, MRI, picture. They just give you a picture of the brain. EEG gives you kind of a video, gives you kind of brain waves. And then fMRI and PET scan give you measures of blood flow in the brain. It's kind of a 3D video of which parts of the brain are more active. Yes, sir?
Sorry, if you go with the person upstairs, what did you say was the non-test?
Oh, knockout procedure. Yeah. There's a free one. I saw another hand, I think up there. Maybe it's been answered. Other questions? Yeah. Yeah, as always, if it's not in the key terms, don't stress about it. Focus on what's on the key terms. Okay, I think I saw a hand somewhere over here. Oh, yes, sir.
Can you explain domain-specific adaptations?
Yes, so actually I'm glad you asked that. I think I could have said more about that. So domain-specific adaptation means the adaptation is for one very narrow thing. Here's a good example that I didn't give, language. Many psychologists argue that humans have a domain-specific adaptation for language. It's not for any, it's just that we have capacities in our brain that are built by evolution that are just for language. A domain general adaptation means it applies to many different contexts and abilities. So the ability to be conditioned, I think is an example I gave, that's domain general, right? It's not for one thing. It's the adaptation is if you do something, anything, and then you feel pain, don't do that again. That's very general. It applies to all kinds of different contexts. So that's the difference there. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
For neuroplasticity, is that valid for like all the regions of the brain, or are there some where like if there's damage to the region, like nothing?
I wouldn't worry about that. So it's generally true that regions of the brain that are gray matter, like that are bundles of neural cells, have less, in fact, if you're older, basically no plasticity, whereas white matter, which is tracts of axons, can recover more easily, but I wouldn't worry about that. Just know what neuroplasticity means. Yep.
What's the difference between heredity and heredity?
Heredity is more broad. I wouldn't worry about it, but heredity just means it's genetically passed on. Heritability is more narrow and technical. It means what extent of the variation is due to genes. But I wouldn't worry about that. I won't test you on the term heredity. It might be in the book, but heritability is the technical term that you should focus on.